This is the panel on the environmental and social challenges of chip production. I think we've been talking about that all day, but we're really going to drill down, and I'm so excited about this dream team of speakers that we have today. Our chair and facilitator today is Jennifer Martin McLeod. She's the program manager of the Arizona Water Sentinels at the Sierra Club Grand Canyon chapter. Jennifer began her career as a wildlife biologist with the Arizona Game and Fish Department before serving as Game and Fish Commissioner for 5 years. In 2018, she was elected to the Central Arizona Water Conservation District Board of Directors, where she served on key committees for 6 years. And since 2014, she's led the Sierra Club's Water Sentinels program, managing statewide efforts in water quality monitoring, habitat restoration, and policy analysis. Before I turn it over to you, Jennifer, I'll just remind everybody that we're going to use the same format for this panel as we did for the worker panel. Panelists, Q&A, then breakout groups. So thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this important discussion, environmental challenges and chip production. As we know, bipartisan interest in onshoring chips manufacturing is reshaping industrial policy in the United States. It's meant to rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity, strengthen supply chains, and keep us competitive in a world that runs on semiconductors. Here in Arizona, we've become one of the country's biggest hubs for this new wave of investment, from the massive TSMC site north of Phoenix to Intel's expansion in Chandler, and new proposals popping up across the state. But while this industrial shift is often discussed in terms of jobs and innovation, what's often left out of this is the environmental subject, and that's what brings us to this discussion. Chip fabrication is one of the most resource-intensive industries on Earth. Each chip requires hundreds of process steps involving ultra-pure water, toxic chemicals, and high energy demand. The result is a technology that powers our phones and computers, but also strains our water supplies, burdens our climate, and exposes workers and nearby communities to significant risks. Here in Arizona, we're building fabs in a desert that's already facing groundwater overdraft, shrinking river flows, and rising temperatures. A single large fab can use millions of gallons of water per day, comparable to a small city. The water that is used to rinse silicon wafers repeatedly in the clean room process, where even a speck of dust can ruin the project. The water must be treated to extreme purity standards before and after use, a process that itself consumes significant resources. While some of the water is recycled, much of it cannot be, or just isn't. And in a desert state like Arizona, that's a major concern. Our groundwater and surface water supplies are already under enormous strain, with declining aquifers, a shrinking Colorado River, and growing competition among cities, farms, and industry. The arrival of multiple new chip plants raises hard questions about whether our water management systems are prepared to handle these added demands. Then there's the chemical footprint. The semiconductor manufacturing involves hundreds of chemicals, acids, solvents, and gases, many of them hazardous. Even small leaks or releases can threaten workers, nearby communities, and groundwater. Some chip-making processes also involve PFAS, the so-called forever chemicals that persist in the environment, find their way into rivers and aquifers, and even the air. And they persist in the environment and are linked to serious health effects. Arizona currently lacks strong statewide monitoring or disposal requirements for PFAS and industrial wastewater, leaving potential gaps in oversight as this industry grows. The industry calls these substances essential, yet they pose long-term hazards that outlast any chip we make. Energy use is another big piece of the puzzle. Chip fabrication requires constant temperature and humidity control, clean rooms that operate 24/7. That makes these facilities among the most energy-intensive in the world. In Arizona, where much of the grid is still powered by natural gas, That means higher carbon emissions unless manufacturers make serious investments in renewable power and energy efficiency. So where do we go from here? We need to ensure chip manufacturing is done responsibly. That means full transparency about water use and waste disposal, aggressive investment in on-site recycling and renewable energy, and stronger state oversight of industrial water and chemical management. Arizona has an opportunity to set a national example. If we align the economic and security ambitions with various environmental safeguards, we can show that innovations and sustainability can coexist. This begins with a genuine analysis of the unique impacts of an industry like this in a desert, and leads to discussion of transparency, accountability, and what is truly in the public interest. If we ignore the warning signs, if we allow short-term growth to outpace long-term environmental and public health, we risk deepening our state's water crisis and creating new pollution burdens that will outlast the technology itself. So today we're asking, how do we balance innovation and sustainability? How do we ensure that this industrial boom doesn't just subsidize the next generation of pollution and resource depletion, but instead drives a new generation of accountability and clean manufacturing? The semiconductor boom is being sold to us as a boon for our local economy, but at what cost? What should we know about how chip production could affect Phoenix Metro and other communities around the country where these factories are being built? We have 4 outstanding speakers to help unpack those questions. Lenny Siegel with Center for Public Environmental Oversight will begin by looking at chemical use, especially PFAS and related pollutants, and what we can learn from past contamination issues. Nathan Taft from Stand.Earth will then bring in a global perspective, highlighting the climate and health challenges that have emerged in Southeast Asia and what the US can and must do differently as manufacturing expands here. Claudia Magana with Organized Power in Numbers will speak about how Arizona's semiconductor manufacturing boom intensifies the region's housing, labor, and environmental crises. And finally, Harry Mannon with the Sierra Club will discuss how communities can leverage the scale of chip making to push for a public purpose innovation agenda. After their presentations, we'll open it up for Q&A and discussion, so please be thinking of questions as you listen. And let's start with Lenny from the Center for Public Environmental Oversight.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Before I start, you can read a whole lot more about what I'm saying at my website, www.cpeo, that's for Center for Public Environmental Oversight.org. Back in the day, in the 1970s, when I started writing about the semiconductor industry, people thought it was a clean industry. The products didn't drip oil. People wore bunny suits in so-called clean rooms, and the buildings looked like college campuses. But the truth leaked out in the early 1980s, and the semiconductor plants throughout Silicon Valley were found to be leaking TCE and other toxic chemicals into our groundwater. I'm still working today on the cleanup of those sites as an oversight of EPA's Superfund program. Phoenix experienced the same thing. Motorola's plume from the 52nd Street facility is 7 miles long going to the west. And there are other sites, Motorola 56th Street and Indian Bend Wash, where there's also TCE contamination back from those early days. A few years ago, NASA, which now owns Moffett Field in my community, was studying PFAS at the former Navy base, and they came up with the idea that the semiconductor industry also used PFAS. I didn't know that. I've been studying the semiconductor industry for 50 years, and didn't know that. It turns out that they use hundreds of PFAS, thousands of uses, always introducing more, and they consider it essential. We don't know yet whether the systems for treating TCE are spreading PFAS in the environment. And then I have the same question about South Indian Bend Wash, where there's PFAS, where semiconductor plants used to be and maybe still are as far as I know. PFAS, the so-called forever chemicals, are noted for the strong bond between carbon and fluorine, and they're very persistent. Some are so-called long chain, which are more toxic, and those have been phased out by the semiconductor industry. And some are short chain, which they thought were less toxic, but they're as toxic as TCE, and they spread easily in the environment, and they're harder to remove. A few years ago, Cornell University did a study of the wastewater. Well, the industry won't tell us which PFAS they're using, other than a few compounds. But Cornell University did a study of wastewater from Global Foundries in New York and Vermont, and that's what we know about the PFAS. Most of the PFAS that they found in the wastewater from the semiconductor plants are non-targeted, which means EPA's methods, even their newest methods of detecting them, won't find them. So not only are these chemicals unregulated, we aren't told what's being used. We only can use the wastewater to determine what may have been used, because the chemicals, whether forever chemicals, sometimes they do transform in the process. So the biggest environmental issue around PFAS in the semiconductor industry is the discharge of the contamination into either waterways or publicly owned treatment works, wastewater plants. And from the wastewater plants, if it's not removed, it goes, and it's usually not, it goes into the environment either in waterways or in biosolids or sludge, which is often spread on agricultural lands. So there's basically no regulation of PFAS discharge. The companies talk about doing something, but their current methods of removing it are unproven, and of course it's hard to prove because they don't have good standard methods of even monitoring it. So that's the biggest issue around PFAS in the semiconductor industry, and that's why the companies are so worried about it, because the truth has leaked out, and as more and more studies are done, we learn what they're polluting. But that's not the only form of PFAS. There are also fluorinated gases, which are used in plasma processes. I don't know how to explain that because I don't know what it is. But fluorinated gases are used in large quantities, and they're released into the environment. Sometimes they are incinerated, which doesn't totally remove the problem. These gases are among the most persistent and potent greenhouse gases that we know of. Now, semiconductor industry is not the biggest releaser of PFAS or fluorinated gases. They're just a major one, and of course, because they're growing so much and they consider it essential, that's why we have to target them to stop these emissions and other releases. Now, I'm mostly talking about PFAS. I talked about TCE, but you should also know that the semiconductor industry is essential to use lethal gases like arsine, phosphine, diborane. These things, when they leak, you have to evacuate the plant. And this is something that you have to be aware of when you do land use planning, because you don't want to put sensitive uses near the plants. But that's something that California is regulating fairly well, and no other state in the country, as far as I'm aware of, is doing that form of regulation. The third form of PFAS, I've mentioned the liquid discharges and the gases are solid PFAS, like basically Teflon. And the factories are made out of these substances, the tubing things, because it's non-reactive, just like, it's non-stick, or like Scotchgard. And so there's a widely used, so Chemours, I don't know how to pronounce it, Chemours, a spinoff of DuPont, makes this stuff in Parkersburg, where the Dark Waters was focused, or in North Carolina. And it's not as big an issue in the plants when the stuff, like your Teflon pan, if it gets scraped, you get some particles, but it's more that it's a huge pollution issue at the places where they're manufactured. And so that's the third form. You've got liquid, gas, and solid. Sounds like a chemistry class. Well, the industry is aware of the problem, and they argue that substitution is not feasible, or at least not feasible in the short run. And fortunately, the Biden administration, through the CHIPS program, set up two programs, Charisma to look for substitutes, and something called PRISM to improve the monitoring, treatment, and destruction of the chemicals. As far as we know, the Trump administration has dismantled that program. So it was headed by the woman who did the Cornell studies. It was very promising, at least for dealing with the discharges. But as far as we know, they were planning to do awards this year. As far as we know, it's disappeared like a lot of our neighbors. So what we've been doing at CCU is trying to organize people nationally to get the PFAS out of our water, and of course the air as well. And it's very difficult because we don't know what they're using, and there's no regulation of any PFAS in wastewater that I know of. There's a little bit of monitoring. Vermont has done a little bit of monitoring, but that doesn't catch everything. So look forward to an ongoing campaign led by people like you all over the country where the semiconductor industry is operating to try to get the PFAS out. Now, I'm a little optimistic because of the history we have in Silicon Valley, where back in the 1980s, when we discovered all these leaks of TCE and other chemicals into our groundwater, the Fire Chiefs Association the fire chiefs of the various cities, developed a model ordinance to control the gases that were used by the industry. And what we found with this is the oil companies, and this was the groundwater too, I guess, the oil companies didn't want any regulation. They sent lawyers and PR flacks to the meetings, but the semiconductor industry, especially Intel, sent engineers. So what we found is that when faced with a problem that they know they're going to be regulated, the industry will send engineers and try to find a way to get regulation that they can comply with. So I'm optimistic if we get together the power to regulate these things, that they'll work with us in a way that allows them to do their work while we make sure our communities are safe. Now, can you bring up my slide? So these are the things that we're asking for. First, transparency. We want to know what chemicals they're using. They keep introducing more of them. We aren't told about them. We want better sampling and analysis so we know what the chemicals are, because most of the PFAS in wastewater are unidentified. We want destructive treatment. What they do now is they filter it and they send it someplace to be incinerated, which is insufficient. We want effluent standards, not just for PFAS and PFOA, or not just for the 40 chemicals in EPA's Method 1633, but total PFAS in their discharges. We want technology-based regulation. That is, we want regulations that will require use of certain destructive technologies many of which are being supported by the Defense Department right now, to actually destroy the chemicals and not just send them someplace else like a community of color to be incinerated. The fluorinated gases I've mentioned, those need to be eliminated. Not just incinerated. Needs to be more support for beneficial substitution, cleaner chemicals. And our goal, I don't know that we formally adopted this, but our goal with the communities we're working with is zero releases of PFAS into the environment. It'll be a long time before they stop using it, but zero releases is our goal. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Lenny. My name's Nathan. I am a senior campaigner at the environmental nonprofit Stand.Earth, and we have a campaign to hold Microsoft accountable to its climate commitments and also its community benefit commitments. And so Microsoft has really two major pieces when it comes to their carbon emissions and issues with polluting the environment, and that is their data centers and their supply chain. And we're here today, obviously, to talk about chips and their supply chain. And for a long time, that was primarily just based in Southeast Asia. And we've worked closely with our allies at Greenpeace East Asia to be monitoring that and looking at TSMC and Intel and Samsung and these other companies that are supplying the components that are running the Microsoft data centers. And with the CHIPS Act and the onshoring of TSMC and Intel in this manufacturing, there's a real question of how are these fabrication facilities going to be powered, right? Is it going to mean, are we going to leave coal plants on for longer? Does it mean we're going to build new natural gas infrastructure? Or does it mean we're going to build out solar panels, right? And we're going to build out wind farms and invest in battery technology to hold this renewable electricity. And so there's this really big connection around both the data centers and the fabrication facilities because they both require just massive, massive amounts of energy. And I feel really grateful to be here today with CHIPS Communities United. I know we've worked together in the past on comment processes around TSMC and Micron in New York, and so it's good to be here and be speaking with you folks, and it's been inspiring to hear the stories from folks who have been up already. So specifically around climate impacts from the fabrication facilities, there's two main sources. And the first is what my friend Lenny here was just talking about for the past little while, is chemicals and fluorinated gases. And so some of these pollutants are, there's this one called nitrogen trifluoride, NF3, and it's 17,000 times more potent than CO2. It's also in the environment for more than twice as long. And so if even a little bit of this escapes, it can have really big consequences. So like Lenny was talking about, there's a lot of things we can do to contain this and be better about it, but that is a huge issue with the chips manufacturing if that's not done properly. So despite the scary number in 17,000 and the fluorinated gases, that's a big problem. But when I first started working on this, I was surprised to learn that the bigger issue, the bigger problem is actually just the sheer amount of electricity that is needed to power the machinery that is being run in these fabrication facilities. And new generation of chips require even larger amounts of energy. We're talking about fabrication facilities that require the same amount of energy as cities with tens of thousands of people just to run the facility, and these are facilities that are running around the clock 24/7. So to get a sense of the scale, TSMC globally, they use as much energy as Sri Lanka, which is home to 21 million people. So a single company is using that much electricity, and so it matters where that electricity comes from. And we've seen in Southeast Asia, you've got single digits renewable energy production. And a lot of that, you've got coal coming in, you've got gas, and when you come here in Arizona, looking at the grid, about 20% of that is renewable, and then the rest is a makeup. The largest portion is gas, and then you also have nuclear and coal. So there is a lot of room for growth, and I don't know, we've been in here most of the day, but it's really sunny outside. There's a lot of opportunity for solar power here in Arizona, and I think as these TSMC and Intel they're building out these fabrication facilities, there needs to be a bigger push to include renewable electricity and to pair that with battery storage. And there's this argument that, well, it's not sustainable, it's too expensive, we can't do it. The cost is dropping year over year. I mean, battery technology just last year dropped another 40%, and it's using less rare earth minerals. You don't need as much lithium and other things. You can do sodium batteries now. So there are these solutions there, and it's up to us to push companies like TSMC and Intel and others to make sure that their fabrication facilities are being powered by renewable energy. And so what we saw with some of the facilities that TSMC has already built, right, they are saying, they like to claim that they're 100% renewable and they're running on these things, and that has a large piece. I don't want to get too into the weeds and too technical, but basically they buy credits. That means that renewable electricity was created at some point in time somewhere in the world, and they're buying the right to that electricity, which will then, so that's not actually powering their facilities. It's still being powered by whatever the local grid has, which is mostly fossil fuels. And then they've also built out, they said, well, we're going to put a solar array on our facility, which is great. They put it on their parking lot, and it's 1.3% of the energy needs of the facility. So they're paying lip service to this idea, and it is right now, it is leading to a boom of natural gas facilities, methane gas facilities, and coal plants staying online longer. And I think something that's pretty ironic is you're going to see, we talked about all the water that these facilities need, right? We're going to see more intense droughts because of climate change, and it's going to become more of an issue. We're already facing that. We've seen it in Taiwan, where during the drought, you had farmers with rice paddies couldn't water their farm because the chip manufacturers needed water for their facilities, and it was prioritized over food for the people who live there. So what can we do, right? I don't want to paint just all doom and gloom, like there are answers here. There are solutions. So as far as the chemicals and whatnot, better containment, recycling, abatement, I would defer to Lenny. He knows a lot more than I do about that, and I think we can go into that more. And so, but there are solutions there that can be done. When it comes to the electricity powering these, there are ways to do it and solutions that can be done. We need to be calling on TSMC and Intel that anytime they build a new facility, it needs to be powered by local, 24/7 renewable energy. And so that's solar, that's wind, that's, there's hydroelectric, which has some also issues, but it has to be paired with battery technology so that it can be powering the facility throughout the entire night. And we can't let them get away with buying these unbundled credits that just allow them to say, oh yeah, we're running on renewable energy, when they're really not actually bringing any new renewable electricity onto the grid. The other piece of this puzzle is, I think there is responsibility for the companies that are buying these components, like Microsoft, like Google, Meta, and Amazon, to put pressure on them to say that their suppliers need to do better. Microsoft wants all their suppliers by 2030 to be carbon neutral. Now, that's actually really great. We're glad they have that goal and that commitment. What are they doing to actually make sure that these companies do that? Because you talk to anyone here, and TSMC is not on track to be carbon neutral by 2030. And so it's going to be the federal environment is obviously not good right now to push these regulations, but there's a lot of power at the local and state level, and we have folks here who had a victory. So I think it's really important to recognize the power that everyone here has and what they can do to put pressure on these companies to do right by their communities and to do right by the climate. Thank you.
Hey everybody, my name is Glai Maganya. I'm with Organized Power in Numbers. We see ourselves as a worker organization. I'm going to talk about housing. That's not what we imagine our focus to be, but it has become that because that is what is one of the most important issues for workers across the board right now. Whether it's through the good grace of their boss or because they have a contract that they negotiated a raise, they're seeing those raises go straight from their employer to their landlord, right? Or to the bank for these outsized mortgages that folks have. And so here in Phoenix, we focus our work in the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, North Carolina is where we have field campaigns. We started building a base of workers here around the pandemic, of folks that were unemployed, trying to get them to focus in on demanding their rights, demanding that their unemployment be extended. And as folks started going back to work, their biggest concern was housing. It was the ending eviction moratoriums. What were they going to do? How are they going to be able to afford to continue living in a city that's expanding rapidly? And so let's talk about what that looks like right now for Phoenix, for the Valley. Right now, families, renters, Homeowners, especially working class folks, are struggling and have limited options. Since 2019, housing costs for renters have increased 23%, while their income has only increased 4%. Doesn't make sense. Like, how do you make that work? So renters are increasingly cost burdened, meaning that they're spending over 30% of their income on housing costs, right? And that's over 50% of renters that are in that position. The housing supply continues to be an issue. It's unaffordable. And while we're seeing record numbers of housing development, a lot of it is single home families. The majority of it is single home families. And what is mixed or mixed use is typically luxury building with very, very few that's actually affordable housing in Arizona, and in a state that often preempts a lot of things that would help make housing more affordable in the cities that are trying to do it. Most workers that are earning a median wage in some of the state's largest occupations, which include food preparations, transportation, material moving, office and admin, they cannot afford a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. These are folks that are raising families, right? So this is the landscape that we're existing in. And as a result of, we're talking about this economic boom, whether it be through semiconductors or other reasons that folks are moving to Arizona, it's not just that we're inviting this boom, but homeowners who want to sell their homes want to get in on this economic boom, right? Developers want to get in on this economic boom. So there's no incentive right now to make housing affordable when there's so much money to be made on expensive, luxury, unaffordable housing. So we're also seeing high eviction rates, right, as a result of this. Folks that are being displaced, primarily Black, Brown, Native communities who are being displaced across the valley. And year after year, Maricopa County is breaking this eviction record, its own eviction record. So last year, we saw over 106,000 eviction filings, which is the highest yet for Maricopa County. This means that families are one dispute with their landlord away from an eviction, one AC bill that they cannot pay in a really hot summer away from an eviction. And these are just the ones that are reported, right? There's often evictions that go unreported that don't go through eviction court because people just give up. They don't feel like they could beat this dispute with their landlord. And just a quick plug here for our work around trying to pass right to counsel here in the city of Phoenix is in response to that, right? Because when it comes to these eviction hearings, only 1% of tenants typically will go to this court hearing with a lawyer, while over 90% of landlords will. These are often unlawful evictions, or some mediation can be met where somebody can at least stay home for a month longer rather than end up on the street, where the city pays for that anyways in a different form. It's probably obvious already, but how does this tie to the boom of semiconductors, right? Well, we're seeing, again, the valley be offered to these developers, to these companies as a place for economic boom, but with nothing being asked for in return. Where they're saying that there's, there'll be workers here, it's going to bring jobs, but where will these workers live? There's going to be some workers who are paid very well, right? And then a lot who are not, because we don't have commitments for neutrality yet. We don't have commitment these are going to be union jobs, and we don't have commitments for affordable housing. And so I think a good lesson here that we can look at that, unfortunately, we're kind of seeing ourselves in a similar position today, which is looking at Intel and Chandler. Intel came in 1980, and a lot of what I'm going to name is what we're set up to see with TSMC if there's no demands of the company or if nothing is won to make that look differently. We saw rapid growth that outpaced housing supply. We saw rising rents and home prices as a result of that, right? The displacement of working class Latino communities, Native communities, Black communities. New development that is all going to be market rate, right? Single family, luxury builds. Again, everyone else is a whole ecosystem that then wants to cash out on this boom. Infrastructure strains, right? So now because the working class cannot live near these facilities, they now have to commute further and further and put more strains on the overall ecosystem and infrastructure of the valley. There's the environmental stress, right? The most obvious being water, groundwater, contamination. And then there's a wage inequality within the boom, which I kind of already touched on, that there will be some very, very high-paying jobs because those are considered professional jobs, but without commitments to workers having collective bargaining agreements, these other jobs will not be good jobs. there will be a host of service sector jobs that are built around these industries to serve those growing populations that are not going to be good jobs. And right now, as we saw there, we have no commitment for affordable housing. There's already development that's coming around where TSMC is being built. A lot of it is single family, it is luxury build out. There's a very tiny sliver of it that is affordable. And we don't have commitments for more at this point. So we see, I think certain electeds, these companies get to kind of pitch this short-term win for the community, but it comes at long-term costs. And so, we're part of, CHIPS Communities United and a lot of partners here in the room, part of a coalition called Power Up Arizona, where we're trying to make sure that we're working collectively to make these demands of our electeds, but also of these developers and these manufacturers to promise something back to these communities so that we don't see the same thing happen again. Obviously, it's not things that they're going to want to give us, so we're going to have to figure out how we fight and leverage for those things. But for this to be equitable, we need to see affordable housing commitments, right? We need to see environmental protections. We need to see the build out of green space. Especially if folks are going to live here, they need more green space. We need to see local pathways for these jobs to be given out to workers that live in the area, so workforce development pipelines, again, collective bargaining agreements, so neutrality, and an overall commitment to work with the community for this investment to work for everybody and not just for the folks who are going to profit from it and walk away. We're looking for folks to not just survive, but to thrive. And that means that we need to really demand more from these manufacturers, from the electeds that invite them in to build here in our communities. I would say without including environmental justice, housing justice, worker justice in these economic developments, it is displacement by design, right? And so that's what we saw and we have seen again and again, and we will see here if we don't organize and be in space like this together to fight back.
Thousands of acres, 500,000 cubic meters of cement, 73,000 metric tons of steel, a city's worth of electricity, and tens of thousands of tons of chemicals per year. That is the projected material, power, chemical, and land cost of a single mega fab. My name is Harry Mannon. I lead Sierra Club's industrial campaign dedicated to decarbonizing and modernizing the U.S. industrial sector. The industrial sector is responsible for about 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. Steel and cement are responsible for about 18%, and chemicals just about fill up the rest of that. So, as you can see, given those statistics, I must work to improve this project to domesticate chips production, and I'm honored to be part of CHIPS Communities United. The stakes are staggering, but maybe there's comfort in the knowledge that CHIPS communities are not alone. Take a steel community in western Pennsylvania, battered by U.S. Steel refusing to comply with clean air protections. The effects of the coal-based process to make the steel has made it that residents of Pittsburgh can't even eat carrots grown in their gardens. The soil is just too contaminated. And take steel workers and their families whose lives changed forever just a few weeks ago when the Clairton Coke Works exploded. Just because the company won't invest in basic upkeep, that could be a CHIPS community too. Take a coal community in West Virginia, losing fishing, hunting, rafting, and camping rights to pristine national forest so a coal company can ravage it, send coal to the Pennsylvania steel community, file for bankruptcy, avoid all liability, and get out of Dodge. West Virginia can be a CHIPS community. Take the community in Cancer Alley, Louisiana, besieged by a fog of carcinogens. Also, the chemicals industry, aka the fossil fuel industry, can make toxics to catalyze what we're told is the most advanced engineering feat known to man, etching transistors onto an integrated circuit in and around Phoenix, Arizona. That could be a CHIPS community. Together, we can make that happen. But why should that be a source of comfort? Every single mega fab is large enough to be a market maker for innovative processes. We have the technology to make pollution-free steel and cement. If just one mega fab demands products of that kind, made in 21st century gems, rather than the 19th century fossils that residents of Pittsburgh have to deal with, that would be a huge victory. The semiconductor industry flourishes in the shadows. If we knew how it was sourcing steel and cement, we could begin to advocate for better alternatives. If we were told the exact chemicals that would be used and their purposes, we'd be better able to innovate and substitute. By illuminating the dark side of the chip and demanding utter transparency from these companies, chip workers and chip communities are able to better protect themselves. And from there, we'll have the makings of a national movement that unites communities up and down the chip supply chain. Suddenly, the United States seems to be in the business of nationalizing corporations and showering billions of dollars on them, no strings attached. If billionaire Republicans can do that, what's in the realm of possibility for us? What could be the cascading benefits of CHIPS communities across Arizona and the nation demanding zero pollution, demanding replacement and elimination of harmful chemicals? Well, you're in luck. I have a story of what that could look like. Such demand can give a jolt to steel making in the Midwest. Pure iron will be made with hydrogen, made from electricity, generated by wind turbines, made with new American steel in the Great Lakes. This clean, union-made steel can be used to build the fabs, and also it can be shipped down to the Gulf in the form of massive turbines to outfit new energy production to make clean feedstocks to defossilize, decarbonize, and detoxify the petrochemical industry. You know what? And maybe data centers, as we were just hearing, and AI companies will demand that chips be made in innovative ways that don't use as much power and need as much water once they're in the data center. Maybe manufacturers and chip companies will go to President Trump and say, you know that industrial demonstration program that you authorized in the Energy Act of 2020, but now are opposing only because President Biden was the one who managed to fund it? Well, it's investing billions of dollars in clean steel, clean cement, clean chemical manufacturing processes, and we like that. Maybe they'll go to the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, and say, you know that bipartisan R&D program, PRISM, Charisma? It'll shed some light on the toxic chemicals we use. That would be good for us. Can you end your seizure and allow those programs to work as intended? And maybe they'll go to your governor and they'll say, your constituents are sure giving us grief and we got to make a deal. For now, that's just a story. It's a story that frankly can cause some problems for me and Sierra Club. What will Sierra Club's base think? Will they think we really ought to support a public works project to dredge up the Mississippi River to make it able to accommodate massive wind turbines shipped down to the Gulf? Will it think there's a such thing as a less harmful chemicals industry, let alone in a region as inundated with pollution as the Gulf? I really don't know what Sierra Club will think. But that is a good problem to have. It's a problem I want. It's a problem I want you to create for me. Thank you for your time and passion. Let's make some good trouble.
Thank you all so much for your thoughtful comments. That leads us right into the Q&A. I'll actually kick it off, and you all can begin raising your hand and queuing up, and there will be a mic moving around the room. One question I'll pose to anyone in the panel who would like to answer it. You all touched on solutions that you see for the problems that we've been identifying. My question is, and Harry, you touched on this a little bit with past examples of things that have gone right. What gives you hope that we can and will align technological progress with environmental and community protection through some of the solutions that you've identified? What gives you hope that we can and will do that? And we can just pass the mic down, and we're interested in your thoughts. And then we'll take it out to the room.
Well, I touched on this. The semiconductor industry is led by people who are not necessarily anti-environment. They just happen to separate Moore's law, the shrinking of transistors, from that concern. If we can convince them to partner with our communities and their workers, they're led by engineers, and they're willing to work on solutions. That was, again, the PRISM program we mentioned. So it's possible, but it's only going to happen if people like us are organized.
I think one of the things that gives me hope is just the power I've seen over the years of local communities. Before I was working on our Microsoft campaign, I was working with local communities fighting back against fossil fuel infrastructure. And when a community comes together around an issue and is really willing to work together and push back and fight back, there's very little that they can't accomplish. So I think we're shining a light here on these issues and bringing people together, and I think using that power, we have a good chance of creating a better future for everyone.
I think what gives me hope is who's in the room today, right? We have Chispa Arizona, who does environmental justice work. We have the painters who do development, right, and are focused on workers. We have, folks here that are really committed to environmental justice and policy. So we have the right folks and the right ingredients in the room. It's about just continuing to work forward from there. It'll take a lot of work and a lot of time, but at least we're starting from the same room together.
Community organizing is first and foremost. I think it's incredibly valuable to have a ground truth model that works for the community and works for chips production. But just to give a recent policy victory in a similar sector, which was hinted at maybe earlier, Microsoft recently struck a deal with a Swedish steel maker named Stegra for Stegra to make virtually zero pollution steel that will be used in Microsoft's data centers. Now, why would Microsoft do that? I think maybe there's two reasons. One, there's a lot going on when it comes to trade policy, and it would be awfully nice if Microsoft knew that it could count on a consistent supply of steel. So that solves that. The other thing is Microsoft is a consumer brand, and there's reputational risk if they're not meeting climate demands. And we got to figure out how to make sure how those off-takers of chips, the Microsoft, the Google, the Amazon, know that communities and consumers are watching them and their relationship with the chip makers. Right now, Intel, TSMC, they're thriving in the shadows. We need to make sure that their names are out there, and Microsoft, Apple, Google, and others know that there's risk if they are not pushing them to be better actors.
Thanks. This is for Nathan. Okay, so we've got Amcor going very close to our community now, not in our community. What do you recommend we do as a small grassroots group to work with our politicians who don't really care to listen to what we have to say, but we're pretty persistent about it? What can we do to get Amcor to use the energy that won't tax our community, like solar? What do you recommend that we do?
It's a really good question. So I think it's, first off, the bigger you can make your movement from all different segments of your community, I think you'd be surprised how many different people might be concerned about this when they understand what's at stake. even across political lines, right? Regardless of your, Democrat or Republican or whatever, no one wants their kid to get asthma or cancer or something because of a facility that was built next door. So I think building as broad a coalition as you can helps a lot. After that, I think identifying a champion in whatever political store, whether it's the city or the county or a regulatory board, finding a champion there that you can work with, and if you can't find one, none of them want to work with you, figure out when the next election is or when the next appointment is, and work with someone to get them on that board or on that council. So it's building support across multiple sectors, and then it's leveraging that to win power in the community over the decision makers. And so either they're going to listen to the community or they're going to be out of a job. And when local folks get together, I think folks underestimate how much power they have. But when you're talking to someone at the federal level, they have to answer to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of people. When it's the state or the local level, your voice is much louder because they are accountable to less people, which means you have more influence over them and what ultimately they do for you and your community.
Some of you may know more about this, but some of these decisions are actually local, like Chandler looking at the wastewater permit for Intel, and I think some of you may have been involved in testifying about that. So even though the federal government's gone to hell and the state government's iffy, it's still possible to organize locally and have leverage over these plans.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jess. I'm an organizer with Chispa Arizona, and electric bills are expensive. I don't necessarily think I have a question. I feel like I've learned a lot. I think knowing kind of what's going on in Arizona and Phoenix in particular, as an example, like the city of Phoenix just raised our water rates 40% because of the drought. Our electricity companies are continuously increasing our rates, and I've learned, from city officials that they're expecting our energy companies to produce 5 times more energy over the next 10 years, 5 years, just so we can have an industry like chips and like the semiconductor industry. And so I think that maybe and also we're talking about water is a huge issue. Like our farmers, especially small farmers, don't even get their water delivered anymore. And if they do, it's because of drought contingency plans, that they had to take water from the native communities that have the water rights out here. So I think it feels like a larger issue that we should be talking about, like consumerism and what are we putting these chips in, and why are we, like electronics, why do we need a new iPhone every year, a new computer, really thinking about the bigger picture and how much just to have this factory is taking all of these resources. And then once those resources are gone, they're going to leave and we're still going to be here. So I think that's my biggest worry. And I think I've learned a lot. So thank you for being on the panel, everyone who's talked today. And I just kind of wanted to share my reflection about that.
Thank you to all the panel members, and thank you for the organizers of the event, and thank you for everybody that is here, even in the audience. It's been an amazing event and awesome to see the work that is happening at grassroots level all across the board. And I'm curious and wondering as to, such good work, amazing work, hard work happening, how much are the organizations uniting with each other, working with each other, because alone we can only do so much. Whereas if we come together and leverage each other's strengths, that's, I think, where we can move mountains and, you know, whoever the giants are, we can handle. So I'm wondering.
I remember years ago somebody asking me, how do you environmentalists get along with labor in Silicon Valley? You know, aren't you fighting each other? And I said, well, the head of the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, the chair of the board is the head of the Labor Council. The interests of first workers live in our community, but they, you know, the plumbers and the other workers who are exposed during construction and things like that, they have the same interests. And so don't buy this thing that somehow labor versus the environment. We're the same.
I mean, I think, Judith, you can add, CHIPS Community United is a coalition, right? I don't know if you want to answer that question, but I think that you have built a great coalition that is working on this specific issue. I named another kind of like umbrella kind of group of organizations that are working together to try and figure out, you know, what the solutions are and how we take this on and where's the alignment. I think there's a lot of work still to do, though. I feel like my dream is that every member organization, including unions, does political education at all their member meetings, right? Because I think that there's a lot that we can do to, like, in the captive audiences that we have as organizations and coming from labor, I think there's always missed opportunity to make sure that those folks that are the plumbers living in the community really understand the impact. Not saying we turn away those jobs, because if they're coming, we should make sure they're good jobs. But I think, yeah, there's more we can do, and part of that is it being in collaboration, sharing curriculum, sharing learnings, and if, you know, one organization doesn't have the capacity to, like, build out that, you know, curriculum, we can bring in a partner that can. But yeah, Judith, I think you could answer this pretty well too if you wanted to weigh in.
I think you did it.
Just briefly, I think it's become clear to the stakeholders on the ground and the national groups that this industry is so powerful that if we are to exact a victory, let's say in the form of a legally binding community benefits agreement between the community and the company, that CBA is not going to be meaningful unless if there is a diverse coalition with many, many interests involved, and we all agree to that framework being part of the CBA. It's just not an environment where we're cannibalizing each other's preferences, but rather without everybody united, we're just not going to get anything. They're just too powerful if all the constituency groups are not united.
I think we have time for one more question. So does anybody have another question? Sandy.
Yeah, I think that's true, but when you get to the energy production end of things, these big energy users, the data centers, the chips manufacturing, the mining industry, they're drawing a lot of electricity, and that is driving up the load, and that means coal plants are running longer, more gas plants, and I feel like there isn't the kind of unity at that level. The utilities have been very effective at dividing and conquering. And so I wondered if you had a bit of advice for someone like me who would like to, to see that change. Thank you. Oh, sorry, Sandy Barr with Sierra Club.
Sandy is not just with Sierra Club, she's the head of Arizona's Sierra Club.
Woo! Thank you, Sandy. So I think we look at these, the chips manufacturers and the bigger umbrella companies that are running the data centers. They have more money than God. I mean, they're coming in here with just like spending yearly, annually spending more money than like the GDP of most countries. And like, we need to put the onus on them to be investing in renewables and at a bare minimum using their status to say like, we're going to come to a grid that can provide us with the most renewable energy and use that as a bargaining tactic. So instead of them being, the utilities competing, well, who can give them the lowest rate and the best tax rate and all these things, it's, well, we can provide this much renewable energy, this much renewable electricity. And like Harry was mentioning before, Microsoft and these other companies have a brand and have a reputation to uphold. So I think that we're starting to see more corporate campaigning and more pressure on these brands to essentially do right by their climate commitments and do right by these communities, and hopefully we can ultimately push them to make the investments that are needed in the communities that they're going into to do these community benefit agreements, and to also make sure that the electricity they're sourcing is 24/7 local renewable energy before they turn these plants on.
You talk about Microsoft's reputation. They didn't invent planned obsolescence, they just perfected it. I'm not sure what kind of reputation, but I've always, back to my days at Stanford during the Vietnam War, I've always believed in research-based organizing. So 3 years ago, I didn't know about the PFAS discharges from the semiconductor industry. I didn't know how much Google search or ChatGPT use was draining in energy. This conference is a step in research-based organizing. That is, once we know what they're doing, then we can figure out what to demand, and we can educate our communities to move toward their demands. So again, understanding the situation is such a critical part of making things change for the better.
What an amazing panel.